please do be sure that you're comfortable and maybe in the way of a little breeze or something, and that you can see and everything. And I don't know how Dr. Franks feels. I know he's going to welcome questions afterwards. If there's something that really confuses you, I know you will. Most of you have really good background, but if something just seems confusing, just raise your hand at the time, because we want to be sure that...
I'd rather deal with questions along the way.
Okay, well, keep that in mind, because otherwise I'll be poking you if you don't ask something. Dr. Franks is a professor at St. John's Seminary in Boston, where the priests for the Boston Archdiocese are trained. And also, like I know Springfield, I don't even know if they have a seminary, but I know that a lot of their priests are trained at St. John's Seminary. And you have something else going on, too. Don't you?
Well, at the seminary we have a burgeoning lay formation program, the Theological Institute for the New Evangelization. So we run a lot of programs out of that.
So a lot of people study with him who aren't planning to be priests. And we have two people who are volunteering at Mass Citizens now who moved to this area in order to be in your program.
Two?
So we're very pleased about that. And Dr. Franks has 5 children who go down, who start at 10 and go down to a new baby named Maximilian. So we're really, really fortunate to have him. He's on vacation, but he's coming this week here and next week to Boston to talk. So we thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I love speaking to your age group. So please, because you've got excitement and I want to see it. I want to see you interacting with the presentation. Given the age range, I think there's a fair age range.
Pretty much 10 through 12.
Okay. Still. Even in that age range, there's some difference. I want to see what gets you and what leaves you confused, and I want to hear about both. If you find something that's exciting, please follow up, and if you find something confusing, just follow up. So it's a basic talk about what it means to be pro-life, based in what we understand with reason, what we understand by faith. Most of us here, I suppose, are Christians, and I guess most are Catholics. How many are Christian? And then the subset would be Catholics. Okay, good. All right. So most of my references are, in fact, to Catholics. But it doesn't have to be, because I can play this anyway. The issue is, we've got this really tragic, well, it's more than tragic, it's barbaric situation where this country that we love, the greatest nation on earth, has the legal right, defends in law the right to privately execute the unborn, the elderly, the disabled. So Massachusetts Citizens for Life and other pro-life groups seek to restore the right to life of the innocent in law. Right? Those who are threatened by abortion, those who are threatened by euthanasia, and by the new forms of biotechnology like embryo-destructive research. What we've got, therefore, is a private right to kill, and we've got, in society as a whole, a war against the weak. Now, young people are naturally repulsed by this, because young people are still close to what it means to be normally human, right? It is repulsive to kill the weak. Human beings know this. It takes a lot of pseudo-sophistication, a lot of so-called growing up for us to forget that. And I don't want you ever to forget it, right? There will be pressures that you face, you're facing them now, you know that. You will face them more in college. You will face them as you go into work, as you enter wider social networks. There will be this pressure to say, treat this bizarre. This is bizarro world, right? Where we treat as somehow basic to American freedom the right to kill the powerless. We know America is better than that. We know we can't have this situation, and that's why we put so much on the line to defend the powerless. It's not a religious issue to defend the powerless, not as religion is usually understood. It is religious, actually, in the broadest sense, that every human being, by using reason, should come to recognize that we should worship God. That's not a Christian thing, that's just a human thing. But religion, as usually understood in America, means being Christian, being fundamentalist, being Catholic, whatever. And it's, in that sense, it's in no way, being pro-life, is it religious. Okay? The pro-life movement is, in fact, the most radical human rights movement of this or any age. Now, you may know this, I don't know if people will be ready to read these books still, but The Lord of the Rings, right? Frodo says he wishes that he did not have this task, right? And Gandalf points out, we don't choose the age we're placed in. We're given this time, this responsibility. And you should feel, so it is, it's a grave responsibility. No other age has faced this widespread extermination of the powerless on this industrial scale. Pre-Christian cultures did commit abortion all the time. It was one of the radical things of Christianity to come in and say, don't kill your babies. But we have technological power now that other ages didn't have, and we kill so many. According to the World Health Organization and the Planned Parenthood research arm, Alan Guttmacher Institute, we kill over 50 million babies a year in the world. It's a scale of human destruction we've never seen. I mean, all the wars in history don't come up to this, a few years total of this. So, we've been given an age in which there's a really dreadful horror going on. But don't look at it just at that. You can look at what kind of greatness is being called from me in the face of this. Because we've never seen such widespread intentional destruction of human life, it takes heroes of a caliber we haven't seen before. And that's what you're called to be. And you can't. Each one of you can make that difference, really. It'd be one person who's on fire. How many of you have seen, what was the movie about the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in England? Amazing Grace. Wilberforce, just one man who is committed to justice, one woman committed to justice, it can change everything. Get a room full of you really can. All right. So so it's horrible what we're facing, but in fact we get to be part of the most radical human rights movement of this or any age. It's most radical because we're talking about the most vulnerable human life. I mean, in ages past, in pagan ages where they killed babies all the time, they couldn't get in and kill embryos the way we do when we do embryo destructive research. But we do this all the time with biotechnology, right? That's the bad side of biotechnology. We need to emphasize the good uses, adult stem cell research. We need to be intelligent and say, look, don't settle for easy answers which disregard the dignity of the powerless. And, a word I think that still draws on people, even amidst this hookup culture and widespread consumerism, I still think the word, you can tell me, does the word justice still resonate among the young? You want to be on the side of justice, right? I do think that still works. And, the social situation is not great out there, but justice is something we all want to be on the side of. Well, this is the most radical justice cause, because we're talking about the most powerless life. The rest of my talk will be structured to show that both faith and reason, first I'll start with reason, show that this is so. There is no social justice without being pro-life. Now that, for most people, is news, because there's this tendency to treat social justice as if it's over here, it's feeding the poor, whatever, socialized healthcare, whatever, and then on this side, being pro-life, and they somehow are opposed. Now, I won't get into those other issues and the fact that we can disagree on how we, for instance, deliver healthcare to people. But what we cannot disagree on is you protect the innocent. You protect the weak. And that's the first step in social justice. So we want to ask, what is this life that we're defending? We're talking about human life. What is man? Now it's not PC to use these terms anymore, but frankly, this is the way the English language works. That when I say man, I mean the individual of the human species. In other languages, there's a distinction between the male of the species and a different word for the male of the species and for the species, the concrete universal as a whole. But here is one word, it's used two different ways. In this case, it means male and female, as we have in the verse in Genesis, right? God created man in his image, male and female. He created them. Science tells us what a human being is an individual of the species Homo sapiens. And there is no scientist who is worth anything who doesn't know that that human line begins at conception. So don't let anybody tell you that this is a religious belief. I mean, in no reading of religion is that the case. This is simply scientific fact. There was a time before the 1800s where we did not know when human life began. But modern embryology is built on this, and I think Linda Thayer will go into this next week into more detail. What we have when the sperm and the egg unite is a self-organizing organism that goes on as long as there is the suitable conditions for nutrition and so on. And it's the beginning of a life cycle that, so our beginning was at our conception. This is a scientific fact. It's not a religious so-called belief. Now, let's go on to philosophy. That's just science. Now, if we use our minds philosophically, that is, we just ask more questions. That's all philosophy is asking more questions. Further questions. If we reflect on the scientific data with further questions, we find that, in fact, the human individual is, among all the animals, different because it's the rational animal. That's what the nature of a human being, of a man, is. So, and it's important to get this because when Darwin brought in evolutionary theory, it was very important for us to make distinctions, and we haven't always made the distinctions. That more complex human life, that more complex life follows more simpler forms. That's clear from the fossil record. So we don't need to fear these facts. We don't need to fear that the Earth is, that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. This is not. In fact, it actually, the more we know about this, the more amazing God's design appears. What is a mistake, though, is to assume that Darwinian theory, on its face, is what it claims to be. That is an account of what it means to be human. That is, it's something random. That we are just like any other species, randomly being generated based on the interaction of environment and mutation. That's not a scientific conclusion, it's a bad philosophical conclusion. There might be a question here on evolution. So on the one hand, I want to say, look, we must be open to the findings of evolutionary science. On the other hand, we cannot take at face value the false philosophical claims that often come with that, saying, we're just random accidents. God willed us. That's why God created the universe 13.7 billion years ago, is so that we have the billions and billions of human beings that we have and have had. Will. Maybe evolution isn't a problem for people here. In a different audience, when I don't have mostly Catholics, it is an issue, so that's good. So, we have natures. The human nature is rational. That is, it is capable of asking questions, it is capable of thinking, judging, deciding, loving. This capacity is there from the beginning. So even though a human zygote cannot clearly talk, the human zygote, as any human individual can, is capable of, has all that is necessary for, except that is as the nature that it is. All that needs to happen is that the body develop and that there be a spiritual education in a way that unfolds these powers. But these powers belong to that individual. So if you provide the right environmental factors and you provide a loving home and a spiritual formation, this child grows up to become an adult that does immense things in the world that are surprising, that you couldn't have calculated in advance. Because of the nature of the thing. The human being is what he or she is before he or she does anything. Okay? If you have some kind of communication amongst dolphins or chimpanzees or even among bees, right? You must recognize that that doesn't take away the fact that humans are the only rational animal. Because whatever bees are communicating with their waggle dance, it isn't what is the world like. this is the way to get the nectar, right? They're not asking questions. And no matter how the fantasies we might have about dolphins and how complex their social life is, they're not asking, isn't it wondrous to be in the water? They're just not. Okay? Only human beings can do that. That's the difference. Even if there's forms of communication, right? Our communication communicates questions and answers. So this particular animal, the human animal, has an incomparable dignity. That's why we defend human life in a way we will not, if we are thinking clearly, will not do the same exactly for other animals, though we as human beings will not be wantonly cruel. That's not very human. This is just to give you, this might be a little bit, yeah, well, so I'll just do this quickly. The powers of the human soul, and they're there from the beginning, are reason, rational appetite, will, and sense appetites. So these are the spiritual powers of the soul. These two are the spiritual powers of the soul. Reason is what distinguishes us, and well, reason and will, because when we know something, we're able to desire it spiritually. That's distinct from our seeing something and desiring it. So you see the pizza, you want it. Okay, that's a movement of our appetites. Every animal, in some way, has that kind of perception and then going towards, if it's something that looks good. But human beings have the second level of desire or appetite, where we can see something with our minds. We can say, I've noticed that person day in and day out at school. The person may be pleasant to look at, but what I really notice is that this person is kind and just and honest, and I want to have a friendship with that person. Well, that desire, that want, only comes because I see something that I can't just see with my eyes. I can understand something about that person. And only human beings can do that. Okay? All right. So, human nature is something that has these intrinsic dynamisms. Every nature has its own dynamism. A heavy thing wants, Aristotle said, it wants to fall to the center of the earth. It would be a little more complicated now, but so the nature of an inanimate thing like this is to drop. The nature of a lion who's hungry in front of an antelope is to go after that antelope. And the nature of a human being is to blossom in the light of truth and love. It is we move around. Why are you sitting in a hot room right now, except that? See, there's an account. You can give an account for why you're here today. Not only that you were driven, hopefully not too coercively, to this event, but there's something in you that's moving you towards this. Some appetite that isn't simply sense appetite. You know that there's this struggle in the world that's the most important struggle in the world, and that's the defense of your power. And so you come into a hot room. Yeah, there's pizza, and that's great. And so your sense appetites are somewhat satisfied. But what you're really getting fed is something that equips you to go out there and fight for the powerless. So the dynamisms in us line up like this. Every nature wants the good for that nature. So a heavy thing wants to get at rest, water flows downhill to find its level, and so on. The lion wants to be satisfied both by eating, but also by reproducing the species, and so on. Therefore, we share this desire for the fulfillment of our nature with everything. We share this desire to survive in being with everything. With other animals, we have this kind of commonality when it comes to reproducing our kind, and that's underlying marriage. And that's, by the way, it's why, I won't get into that issue, but the point, evolutionarily speaking, of sex, of course, is the reproduction of the species. That's why you've got to have a male and female. But that's another talk. Then the things that are specific to humans, really, are truth, the desire for truth and desire for life in society. We are sociable. We want to be friends. We can't really have our powers unfold fully without cooperation. We can't feed ourselves when we're babies. We're dependent on others. So it's a cycle of dependence and responsibility and care. And that's the web of human life. And this is all built into our nature. The natural law, which is formulated in a very clear way in the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments are not simply a Christian or Jewish thing. They're a human thing. Okay, and that's why it's okay to put them on courthouse walls. It's just human law. And law, though, is not about God's imposing His will on us. It's His loving plan for our happiness. The only way we can be happy is if we fulfill these inclinations to the good, to preserve life, and so on. If we go against those inclinations, if, for instance, we violate the inclination to marry by fornicating, there's an old-fashioned word for you, but there's all kinds of forms of fornication in the hookup culture. The point isn't that Christians say, well, tut, feel bad about that. That's not the point. The point is that Christians say, God wants you to be happy. You're not going to be happy that way. You might as well get down and eat grass. That'll fulfill you just as is likely to fulfill you if you eat grass or broken glass than if you secure sexual pleasure outside of marriage. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. That's not how we're designed. So, that's what reason will say about human nature, if we're thinking clearly. Philosophers by profession don't always think clearly, but all of us are called to be philosophers. We're called to think and ask questions and to get clear on things. So what does this all come down to? Well, a living human body, no matter what the form, is a sign of a life that, if innocent, cannot be targeted for death. Because we've got this life that is capable of, that has all these inclinations towards great things, especially the truth and a social life that is in the truth for love, right? It's called communion. You can't just, if there's this life that gets in, this particular life gets in my way, or if it's useful for me to get rid of this life, you can't. This living body, this human body, is a developing body, right? It doesn't stay static. You're going to be much different in a year than you are now. You're still in the midst of this developmental trajectory, right? That's why we protect life at all stages. We don't say, well, it's only when we're adults, fully realize the human organisms, that we get the full protection of the laws. No. We protect zygotes, or ought to, human zygotes, embryos, fetuses, infants, children, teenagers, adults. Notice the distinction here. The sperm and the egg are not individual humans, right? It's only when they come together that you've got a new human being that is self-organizing. A corpse is not the body of a living human being, because the person, well, I don't want to give the person to talk right now, but it's not a body of a living human. But all the stages of human development, that's human life, and conditions. If that human life lives long enough to be elderly and disabled, or even comatose, in a persistent vegetative state, mentally conscious state, these are still human bodies, and therefore are signs of a life that must be respected. They are human. And now I want to quote, so this will be cool if you can, I don't know, get to it. When you get to a cocktail party in a few years, you can say, well, as Emmanuel Levinas says, this is a Jewish philosopher who suffered under the Holocaust. He's a really beautiful thinker, a thinker that John Paul II also loved. And he puts it this way. I have to qualify a few things because he talks about the face. It's very powerful when he talks about it. But instead of just the face, because clearly embryos don't have faces, but get the sense of what he's talking about in terms of the human body, no matter what the shape of it. The first word of the face is, thou shalt not murder. It is an order. If you come across the bare human body, just human life, what does that human life say? I mean, you'll get this more as you become, enter into your spiritual maternity or paternity, right? As most of you will be fathers or mothers, but some even as religious or priests, it's still all the same. When you have someone in your care, you're going to look at that child, for instance, and say, before you think about it, There's someone there who calls forth all the responsibility in me. I've got to give everything up to take care of that bare human life. There is a commandment in the appearance of the face, or the appearance of the human body, as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, so there's this command, the child, the baby, my newest infant, right? There's a command in the baby that you've got to serve this child. And yet, this baby's the poorest of all, right? The face of the other is destitute. It is the poor for whom I can do all, and to whom I owe all. And me, whoever I may be, me, as a first person, I am he or she who finds the resources to respond to the call. There's nobody else. If there's someone who is defenseless, I must defend. I must protect. If somebody's getting hurt and I can do something about it, I must be the one to do something about it. And that's why you're here. If it is not us, then who to defend the powerless? So, human life has irreplaceable dignity from conception. That's simple reason. It's not religious so-called belief. So to sum up, philosophical reflection on scientific data tells us the human individual is the rational animal. Basic ethical reflection, again still in the realm of philosophy, tells us each individual human has the dignity of a human person and endowed with inalienable rights. Now that's the idiom of our nation. I think it's very useful, and after having celebrated our Independence Day recently, we can think with some emotion, I hope, again, about these words from the Declaration of Independence, right? In some way, the fundamental law of our nation. It stands at the head of the U.S. Code. I am very much a believer in what Lincoln thinks, that this Declaration is what controls the interpretation of the Constitution. And of course, we love these words as pro-lifers. We love these words as Americans. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and again, that men means males and females, right? All men, all individuals of the human species are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. There are few words as stirring as these in the history of political thought, and this is why we're proud. I think this is why we're proud to be Americans. And this is monumental. But we, as a nation, have always had to work to live up to this, especially first with the battle over slavery. But if one could fathom something even more of a threat to human dignity than slavery, well, we've got it now in the abortion franchise. So, as true Americans, as loyal Americans, as proud Americans, we say these are the words that must control how we live our lives here. Now, what does faith tell us about what it means to be human? Well, we put it in the terms of being created in the image of God. That's how we have it in Genesis 1:26 and 27. I think I've already indicated that a lot of that being in the image of God is knowable by human reason. It's just the fact that we have the power to know and love, the way that God is knowing and loving. That's what God is, infinite knowing and loving. We are made in that image. We're called to come to know more and more. We ask questions because that's why we're made in God's image. And more questions, more answers means we can love more. We know more, so we love more. As the circle of our intelligence expands, so does the circle of our loving. We don't sit in some stuporous haze where we're in a corner and thinking, well, my life is good, therefore it's all okay. No, we're too intelligent to sit, we, at least pro-lifers, are too intelligent to say, well, my life is okay, therefore it's okay. No. If there's a child who is being killed, it is not okay. We come from God and are meant to return to Him. This return is to be accomplished through our free action. So our human dignity is bound up in our freedom, right? We, unlike other animals, do not come automatically to the fulfillment of our nature. If you give the right elements for feeding and reproducing for a lion, they're going to do what nature says to do. Human beings, we can be given the right conditions, but we choose to do the things that are for our good or not. And we often act against our good. And that is the paradox of sin, right? Is that we act against our happiness. God actually wants our happiness more than we want it ourselves. That's the great paradox. When we sin, we're saying, I'd rather have this good thing, this pleasurable thing now, even if some part of my mind knows it's not really good for me, but I just want it now. This is why your parents, by the way, have done so much work as you've been growing up to get you to delay gratification. It's one of the most basic things about human maturity, that we put off that immediate good, that cookie, right now, say the 5th cookie. And your parents know, well, you know, number 5 is not so good for you. Even though you think, well, that's tasty. The other 4 were. This one's going to be tasty. It may be tasty, but you're going to feel bad afterwards, right? And your parents know that now, because that's in the past. Maybe I still love cookies. And my wife's not. So you've got to delay gratification. But when we sin, it's usually a matter of saying, okay, this thing looks really good right now. I'm going to take that pleasure right now, even though I know this isn't really what's good for me in the long run. Well, that's acting against our nature. If we are acting in accord with our nature, we're doing what God has designed us to do, then we're going to have our freedom fulfilled, and we're going to become more and more free. We're going to be... Notice this. Hopefully none of you... Well, the statistics don't give one much hope on this, but a lot of you, especially guys, are going to face the temptations of pornography. And the fact of the matter is, again, it's not that Christians are going to say, well, tut, don't you feel bad about doing that? If a Christian says that to you, that's a mistake, right? The real point, what should be motivating a Christian who says, pornography is not so good, is to say, we recognize this is not the way we were made. Human love doesn't work that way. And frankly, anybody caught in the pornographic addiction knows that. You don't have to push too hard to say, well, hey man, are you happy? No, I mean, they're not crazy, right? They know that this is something they're stuck in. Well, that is, they're stuck. They're not free. You think you're free, getting to go on the... So in other ages, people had to go to these shops in certain parts of town and do... Well, now I'm free to do it in front of my computer, and I can... You're not free. This is another avenue towards an addictive enslavement. God wants us to be free. And in the end, these are all connected, right? Why I bring in sexual issues, not only because the hookup culture is so devastating, but because, of course, the abortion culture depends, is an entailment of the hookup culture. Because one way or another, the securing of sexual pleasure outside of marriage is going to lead to pregnancy, one way or another. No matter how many condoms you throw out, and no matter how many pills one takes, one way or another, babies are going to result, because that's the design of the thing. And because kids are being told, they're being told a lie. They're being told, just engage in this pleasurable thing. Nobody denies the pleasure of the thing. God designed it to be pleasurable, but He designed it in a certain place, where you have children naturally resulting, and you have a home in which they can be educated. If you take it out of that context, then what you've got is you're telling children, you're telling young adults, you're telling everybody in society, well, just have fun. And then people have fun, and then they say, well, they're pregnant, as if this is magic, right? But they did the things that lead to how babies come about, and then they say, this isn't the deal, we're going to get an abortion. So you've got to see that how those social pressures that you may be confronting right now, at some point you will be confronting one way or another. I hope you aren't confronting them now, but this culture is very insidious in that way. Because it really is attacking your innocence. Satan hates the innocence of children, and with the young, and will do anything to crush it. So that's the kind of struggle we're in. And if we want to stand up for life, we've got to see that our decisions with regard to sex have everything to do with how we stand with regard to life. That's how, by the way, a lot of your age group, when they as they move up, They're pro-life now, as I said, because you are commonsensical. You know that it's not right to kill weak human beings. But you go through college, and all of a sudden those pro-life numbers start to flip, right? The young start to become pro-abortion, pro-euthanasia. Well, one big factor there, other than the things that professors will say, which are not always true, right, is the hookup lifestyle, because they don't want to be hypocrites. And they realize that this lifestyle kind of requires abortion. So you just don't want to be stuck in that, because you know now, you know that justice requires being pro-life. Of all the reasons that one can marshal for not going into a bad sexual lifestyle, that's one you can always keep at the forefront of your mind, saying, you know, it's inconsistent with being pro-life. All right, so that natural law, our inclinations to the truth and to love, are part of, it's our share in God's design of the universe. That's the eternal law. It's His loving plan for all things. Every nature fits in. Ours is the nature that God sets at the apex of all visible creation. This, really, it's something that you must understand about yourselves, that the dignity of each one of you, the dignity of each human being, is that God has chosen you, specifically you, to create out of nothing, because before our conception we did not exist. And He's done that for every single one of the billions of persons who existed up till now, and He was going to do it for billions more. And it's not tough for God to want each of those billions. He's not a population control person. These teeming masses are too much for me to think about. God has chosen each one of us for a specific mission. To love. To know and to love. And that's our role in the eternal law. Being pro-life is essential to our part in God's providential plan. Part of this picture of law, though, is civil law. So we've got, and this will be the topic of the next presentation especially, the laws that we legislate will not exactly replicate the natural law, because we can't legislate everything in the natural law. For instance, it's natural law. It's a natural law necessity that we be grateful when good things are done to us. So, again, why parents teach children to be grateful, to say thank you, is because it's just not much of a human life where things are given to us and we don't feel gratitude. But nobody would, in their right mind, would legislate saying thank you every time you receive something. So being grateful is part of the natural law, but it's not something we would legislate. So there's one aspect in which the civil law won't be coextensive with the natural law. Of course, the more disturbing thing is when civil law goes against natural law. And that is what we have when it comes to abortion. What must be legislated, though? There are certain things that we have to legislate as a people. And it's something that in Catholic terminology we call the preferential option for the poor. We must legislate in such a way that the rights of the powerless are protected. That's the basic requirement of the common good. Because if we're building a society based on social patterns that require the destruction of powerless human life, of elderly people who get in our way because we're tired of taking care of them, or of unborn babies because they're going to mess up my lifestyle, or because as a parent I don't want the shame of my daughter having be a teenage mom and so on. We can't have a just society where we're letting that happen. So then Cardinal Ratzinger had this really clear way of putting it, and this slide will encompass a lot of issues, but it'll go against a lot of what you may have heard in, say, your parish. Not all moral issues have the same moral weight as abortion and euthanasia. While the Church exhorts civil authorities to seek peace, not war, and to exercise discretion and mercy in imposing punishment on criminals, it may still be permissible to take up arms to repel an aggressor or to have recourse to capital punishment. Now notice that. So that's something that's not always clearly taught, but this is something that's absolutely essential to understand. Whether a nation engages in a just war, whether a nation utilizes capital punishment, these are things we can have a discussion about. But what we cannot have a discussion about is whether we're going to kill our babies and kill our old people. There may be a legitimate diversity of opinion even among Catholics about waging war and applying the death penalty, but not, however, with regard to abortion and euthanasia. Social justice begins with defending innocent human life. Okay, I think I'm going to, this is, any questions? Yes?
I was wondering,
Perfect.
sorry, with like capital punishment, if we say that it's okay to kill someone even if they're not innocent, even if they're a criminal, then how can we like justify, I mean, if we say that we can't kill this group of people, then how can we say that we can like kill these people unless it's like absolutely necessary for like preservation of society? I mean, if we say that just because someone has chosen to ignore the natural law, then their life can be destroyed and it's meaningless. I just don't really understand that.
Okay, it's an important question. So, what the pro-life movement is committed to is the restoration of the right to life of the innocent. And why that's an important thing to point out is that human dignity cuts both ways. The fact is, it means that we're free. We're free to act in accord with our nature or against our nature. Now, obviously, one of the most profound ways to violate the dignity that we've been given is to murder somebody. This is the whole question about punishment, right? Is it in accord with human dignity to throw a person into a prison for the rest of his life? This is a serious philosophical question. One of the ways to argue that yes, it is because we say we're taking seriously that this person is a free agent. He's done something freely, an evil thing, a horrendous thing, something that's all of our concerns because it really, if you take the life of an innocent human being, you've done something to the fabric of society that is, strictly speaking, not reparable. You can't fix that, right? You can't restore that. Now, that's an argument you can also use, of course, to argue against the use of capital punishment, but there's the general principle about punishment that because we're free, if we do a free action that's heinous, well, society has the right to punish. Now, where along the scale do you apply that? Well, I won't go into the discussion about capital punishment except to say the Church has always said that capital punishment is possible for a state to avail itself of because of the restoration of justice, because a life has been taken. But clearly, John Paul II especially pled with us not to use it. And that's a discussion as long as we all recognize that capital punishment is not intrinsically evil, we can then have the discussion about whether we should actually use it, though. It doesn't settle the issue to point out that though it's not intrinsically evil. It's a great question, though. I don't want to settle it because the fact is that good people can disagree on it. That's the point of what Cardinal Ratzinger wrote, is that we can disagree. We should talk about it. Well, should we? Maybe in a culture of death, and I think this was part of John Paul's argument, maybe in a culture of death, the sign value of executing the guilty actually puts the innocent in a more precarious position, which is, it's a strong argument. Yes?
How many people in America actually approve of abortion?
Well, the numbers have been very encouraging lately. There's been this shift in the Gallup poll showed that we, for the first time just this last year, have a majority, right? It's a straight out majority of people identifying themselves as pro-life. Now, that can cover a lot of things, but that's the first time it's ever happened. So what we've seen is this generational shift, again, because young people have this natural sense that you don't kill babies, right? In the broad, whether you get to these hard cases, that's another issue, but people know that, young people especially. I take great comfort in that, however, and so you're not exactly alone. I mean, this is in some ways an easier battle to fight than the defense of marriage, say, which is a harder one. That is, generationally, you're seeing a shift towards a stronger pro-life view. In general, the young people are more, a lot of the younger generations have rejected the ideology of the 60s generation. However, the hookup culture is the wild card here, because the lifestyle involved there is it's such a radicalization of the sexual revolution. It's really a battle for the soul of your generation. The question is, if one's drawn into that lifestyle, how long are you going to call yourself pro-life? Because at a certain point, you're young are going to recognize, I'm going to be a hypocrite. And the worst thing for young people is to be hypocrites, right? And there's a value in not wanting to be a hypocrite. It's better, though, not to have pro-abortion opinions. But if one's drawn into a lifestyle that entails abortion somewhere down the line, so we're at a crossroads, and you all are the ones who are going to decide how it turns out. Nobody knows, except I think we have a lot of reason to hope. I mean, you're here, and it's a big deal. It's a really important point. A lot of you are in an environment where you can stand up and be pro-life, and there's going to be some social support. There will come a time, though, when you will not be in that kind of community. And you've got this, one of the reasons you're going through this academy is to get those reasons solidified so that when you are alone, and where there's all this social pressure, where it's no longer the accepted thing to be pro-life, that you can still be pro-life, right? But you know it in your gut. If you know it also in your mind, that it'll keep you strong, even if everything in your life is going to push you away from that. I think I will skip this because it's a little bit much. I've already gone over that. Okay, so here's a nice quote from The Splendor of Truth by Blessed John Paul II. These norms, in fact, represent the unshakable foundation and solid guarantee of a just and peaceful human coexistence, and hence of genuine democracy, which can come into being and develop only on the basis of the equality of all its members who possess common rights and duties. When it is a matter of the moral norms prohibiting intrinsic evil, there are no privileges or exceptions for anyone. So, there are people, there are philosophers, there are theologians who will tell you that there are no intrinsically evil acts. And that sounds like a big word, but it's really important to see that this is, it used to be called situation ethics, it's proportionalism. It means, this is the claim that, well, okay, normally murder isn't a good thing, but if you get in a jam, maybe it's something you do. Rape isn't a good thing, but maybe you could construct this crazy scenario where this has to happen. And there really are serious thinkers who argue this. And try to remember this day when you're in college and you hear most of your professors, because you're going to hear it from most of your professors, depending on which school you go to. But on most schools out there, you're going to hear this as the common accepted view that, well, of course there aren't things that are just evil as such. But we know there are. And you know it now. I just want you to keep knowing it. Okay? Rape is always wrong. Adultery is always wrong. Even if you got lonely people and blah, blah, blah. It's just not going to help the situation. Murder is always wrong. Intrinsically evil. And this is important for democracy. It means that the flip side of all those prohibitions, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, is that there are people who, the people around us that I can't ignore. When I have a desire, I can't run over people and get to what I want. We're all implicitly woven together. In Evangelium Vitae, in Blessed John Paul's encyclical on the Gospel of Life, he points to this contradiction that we're in an age where it talks about justice and rights more than any other age, but precisely in an age when the inviolable rights of the person are solemnly proclaimed, the very right to life is being denied or trampled upon, especially at the more significant moments of existence, the moment of birth and the moment of death. This is a surprising contradiction. But this is also an opportunity because, again, I do think that word justice still Love draws too, but I think in some way justice is a word that will compel people from every group. And what you need to know is that you are the ones who are fighting for justice. Social justice, however you want to talk about it, but it's justice. And if we're serious about justice, for instance, that the rights of every human being be respected, we know that you can't get there by ignoring the right to life of the most powerless. If we're serious about justice, if we're serious about the powerless, we can't ignore the defense of their right to life. So the thing that has led to the surprising contradiction is relativism. It is the air we breathe. All of us just are taught that there are actions that nothing is good or evil in itself. It depends on the situation. But the fact is that relativism runs up against reality. Right? The reality is that none of us wants to be betrayed. Therefore, betrayal is not we know that betrayal is not a good thing. None of us wants to be exploited sexually and left behind, right? And so on. The truth of human nature is that we are created to love and be loved. That is what we are made for. This love is why we want justice, because to have a just society means that we're all together. We recognize the fact that yes, that we are to be united in the truth. Justice isn't just a label that we stick on whatever cultural arrangement we find convenient. Justice is something real, not a figment of our imagination. If truth is not acknowledged, the body politic is dismembered. What we have, in fact, are just then atomized individuals that are getting whatever they want, self-gratifying instead of loving. And you know that justice isn't about that, and we know that love isn't about that. We know that being human isn't about that. So here's this beautiful quote from John Paul, and I think it reflects Levinas's thought. Yes, every man is his brother's keeper, because God entrusts us to one another. And it is also in view of this entrusting that God gives everyone freedom. Notice that. It's because of the fact that we're given to each other to take care of, that we've been made free. We're made free to love. This is a great gift of the Creator, placed as it is at the service of the person and of his fulfillment through the gift of self and openness to others. Those of you who know something about the theology of the body know that this is at the heart of it, right? We make the gift of self by putting ourselves on the line for those in our care. Democracy needs this. America needs this. The world needs this. We can't have a free society. We cannot have a free society. We cannot have a just society that does not recognize that there are certain truths such as God has created every single human with inalienable rights. It's not a matter of social construction. Rejection of inalienable rights that exist prior to our free choice, including the inalienable right to life and unborn. That's what would follow if we think that it's all just made up. This is the basic choice before us. We either think the world is something we make up to suit our liking, our desires, or something that we conform to. Are there people that need us? Is that a reality that we have to take account of, be formed to? So, I think that is. Human dignity lies in freedom. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be made in the image of God. It's something that both reason and faith tell us. Freedom is for love. It's for communion. It's to be with one another, to work for one another, to protect one another. That goes for everybody. I want to make a special appeal, though, to men in the room, that you must feel the call to fatherhood, spiritual fatherhood, because you've got a society that's telling you, and this isn't to give anybody a deal here, but society's has presented a world of just available girls who think it's liberation to make themselves sexually available. Gaming and other toys, it's fine in its own place. But the fact is, you've been called to be protectors of the powerless in a special way. I want you to feel that fault. But all of you. And women, why that call is so why it has to be addressed, especially to men. And the fact is that women have always maintained the world, right? It's the everyday maternal self-sacrifice that keeps the world going. And we can't let the ideologies that say separate you, women, from that. It's the world supporting. It keeps everything going. You have to keep the defense of the powerless at the forefront of our society. Okay. Well, I did a couple questions, but do you have any more questions? A little bit of time. Yes.
Murder's wrong, right? So what differentiates murder from just killing somebody?
Yep.
From killing? What
That's right.
makes it right or wrong?
Good. Kill is a generic act, meaning it's a larger category. So you can kill an ant, you can kill a cow, you can kill... Okay, you can kill in war, you can kill in self-defense, or you could kill a baby. It's not the same as murder, which is it's a specific act. That is, if you kill, that is the 10th, and the 5th commandment should be translated, strictly speaking, should be, thou shalt not murder. Because murder is killing an innocent person. That's what murder is, and you can never do it. That's why in war you can't target civilians. You cannot target civilians. It's intrinsically evil, whether it's we prosecute it in our military, but a soldier who kills another soldier is not committing murder. That's very important to recognize. So it's not an exception. It's not that, oh, this is all murder, but we can sometimes murder if it's in war, or we can sometimes murder if somebody's attacking you. Those aren't instances of murder. It's a very important distinction. If I kill somebody who's threatening my family, I'm actually obligated I'm obligated to do whatever it takes to stop that person from harming my family. I am obligated. It's not an option. If it takes lethal force, then it takes lethal force. It's a horrible thing, but it's not a matter of murder. It's a matter of self-defense. It's a different act. Okay, very important. Yes?
For a war, I know there has to be like, to make killing not be murder, it has to be a just war or something like that.
Right. Well, no, well, go ahead with your question.
I was going to ask, what makes it a just war?
Okay. First, even, say, Saddam Hussein's soldiers who, going into Kuwait, which is clearly was an unjust war, it's just a land grab, they were not committing murder when they engaged in battle with another army. Now, if you're targeting civilians, that's murder. So the justice or injustice of the war itself doesn't mean... let's say the Mexican War may not have been a just war, right, for America. It didn't mean that our soldiers who participated in it were, in killing other soldiers, murderers. Okay? That's why it's important, because obviously a lot of people disagree about whether we should be in the wars we're in now, but we should have no doubt that our men are not murderers, even if these are unjust wars. Okay? The criteria for just war, it means we have to be, it's basically self-defense, broadly speaking, right? It's my people are threatened, the leader of a nation then says, I must do something to protect my people. So it's kind of like the father has to defend his family. Yes?
You say like there can be no discussion on like abortion and euthanasia. Like to what extent does that go? Because it's like...
Yeah, that's good. No, I was putting it too strongly there. Meaning, clearly we have to talk with pro-abortion supporters, what I mean is, it's a mistaken position. We're not in any doubt about. If we're going to talk about the justice or injustice of a certain war, I have to leave room for doubt when I'm dialoguing that maybe I'm not correct in my position, so we can talk. But when it comes to abortion, I'm not in any doubt. I'm not dialoguing to find out, oh, is abortion actually correct? I'm dialoguing because I'm trying to convince the other person to see the truth that they're made to see, which is even
What about like in a case of abortion, in the case of a mother who like has a tumor in her uterus or something, and the baby?
Good. Okay, that was the slide on double effect. Okay. If you take out a cancerous uterus with a baby in it, it is not abortion. Okay? Because what you're doing is, this falls under this thing called the principle of double effect, and it is important to go over, but what you can't do is slice up the baby, extract the baby, and then operate on the woman. You can't attack the child, which is an abortion. What you can do is treat the cancer. So if you've got a cancerous uterus, what does the doctor do? The doctor takes out diseased tissue. You know that the baby's going to die, but you didn't intend it, and you're not attacking the child directly. So we're not committed to a position where a mother can't get treatment. Now, there are women who will opt to put their lives at risk to maintain, but that's not something that's required. That's an extra act. Yes.
So you'd agree that, like, according to the natural law, like, possibly the most important part of it is, like, honoring God, right? Because, like, it's
Yes,
natural law.
that's right.
But, like, it'd be absurd to have legislation about, like, going to church, right?
That's right.
And you touched
That's right.
touched a lot in the presentation on, like, gay marriage and stuff like that, like, how it's very, and I totally agree that it goes against natural law for, like, man to another man, woman to another woman. But, like, can it really be, like, illegalized? Or is it, like, intrinsic to the pro-life movement?
No, no, I mean, that's all me, because Massachusetts Citizens for Life has no position on marriage, because it's a single-issue organization. It's a single issue meaning the right, restoration of the right to life, the innocent law. So it's just me talking. There are arguments for not criminalizing homosexual behaviors. Those are called sodomy laws. They're arguments. What one shouldn't do is say that a state can't pass those laws. A state has every right to do so under its police powers because it's essential to the common good that we have normal sexual relations, because that's what keeps society going on. You have children. That is something that matters to the state. But are there reasons not to? In fact, we have a Supreme Court decision that overturned our sodomy laws. I think that was a wrong decision because it takes away the state's right to do it, to legislate, but it may not be the wrong practical decision. That is, I think I agree with what you're implying here, that there are really good reasons not to criminalize sodomy. Because now we can say, in the gay marriage debate, look, don't make us recognize your so-called marriage. We let you do whatever you want.
I thought you were referring to gay marriage.
Oh. Well, gay marriage isn't a that would be, we're taking a positive act to recognize something that, in the nature of things, isn't a marriage, because marriage requires male-female complementarity. But this is just me talking. That it is essential. I do think these are related issues, but it's essential to sex and procreation. They go like this, and that's where it touches the abortion debate, because we've broken that link.
Thank you very much. I'm going to finish here because we have another speaker. But the thing is, when we say that pro-life movement is a single issue, just think of how many issues it is. There's unborn babies, there's infants, there's people with disabilities, people who are elderly. That years ago, abortion, just because it was part of the natural law, it was obvious to everyone, was illegal in all the states. And some states did a few things to their laws, but basically what happened in 1973 was that the Supreme Court of the United States said, we don't personally believe that we know when human life begins, in spite of the fact that every embryology book said when human life begins. So they decided that states could not make any laws against abortion, is what it boiled down to. And this, you'll be hearing this the last week. We'll have some legislators, and we'll be talking about where we are now. But we're very fortunate to have Tom Day, who is a lawyer, and he talks fast like a lawyer. Tom, his father sort of ran Western Massachusetts pro-life activity for many, many years. So, like the Diggins family and other families, he's been coming to things since he was this big, you know. And but because he's a lawyer, and because it's very important for you to understand, I mean, we've just said, and we agree with Dr. Franks, if, you know, there's certain basic things that, as St. Paul said, are written on our hearts. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't get that. So Tom is going to be telling us about the court decisions and it helps us to know how we got where we are and even where we can go from here. So we're very grateful to have him come down.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to disable this because it's either that or I'm going to go flying at some point. I'll give you plenty of reasons to laugh at me today, but I don't want to give you any more than I have to. Again, my name is Tom Day. I'm the regional coordinator out in Pioneer Valley, the Pioneer Valley Mass Citizens for Life. And as Ann said, I come from a family of pro-life activists, so I've been around the movement for a long time. I don't know if that's a plus or a minus, but it did, as I was preparing for tonight's speech or presentation or whatever you have, it was very humbling to realize how little I knew about the actual legal history of Roe versus Wade, what came before it, what's come after, and where we're going. And so first, a disclaimer. You've just heard from the pro, and now you're hearing from a rank amateur in this area. And this is something you can be very active in the pro-life movement for years, or be around it as I was for years, and never really delve into the intricacies of these various legal opinions and what they mean. And part of the reason is because I think it's extremely confusing. The wording of these opinions and the way that these opinions are configured is extremely confusing. And that should be a red flag to you, that if they have to take their ideas and bury them in mountains of legalese, what's underneath there is nonsense. And so that is, if you take nothing else away today, take away the fact that Roe versus Wade and its progeny, and the cases that have come after it that have upheld Roe versus Wade, are complete and total nonsense. There's no basis for these opinions. And what Roe versus Wade says, to just boil it right down, it says that there is a constitutional right. So in the Constitution, we all know you have the freedom of speech, you have the freedom of religion, you have the freedom to be against self-incrimination. These are all recognized freedoms that you have and rights that you have in the Constitution. And what Roe versus Wade says, in addition to that, there's also a right to an abortion. So back when they wrote the Constitution, and then specifically in 1868 when they passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, what they did is they created a right to abortion. And if you haven't read the 14th Amendment recently, I'll save you some time. Don't go looking for the word abortion in the 14th Amendment because it's not there. What they did is they said that there's a right to privacy guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And that includes the right to abortion. And again, if you haven't read it, don't waste your time because you won't find privacy in the 14th Amendment either. That word isn't there. The due process clause of the 14th Amendment does not include a right to privacy. What the courts did is they found a right to privacy in what they call the penumbras of the various rights that are understood, the various rights that are explicitly in the Constitution. And so, could anybody here tell me, and I hope you can't, can anybody here tell me what a penumbra is?
Sort of like the shadows at the end.
Exactly right. It's a shadow, and the reason why I know that is because yesterday I looked it up in the dictionary. I had no idea. and I saw I ended up on I don't know, Webster's.com or something, and I found, because we don't actually pick up a book and look in the dictionary anymore, and they had an explanation which was helpful to me and hopefully to you as well, because you really do need explanations to figure out the nonsense in these opinions. But think of it as an eclipse, and you're looking at an eclipse, and you've got the actual shadow, the moon, and then behind it you have the bright light, which is the sun, and then there's this kind of area, this kind of glow around it, which is kind of a gray area. It's kind of a shadow. It's not really the shadow. It's not really the light. Not really the darkness. Not really the light. Not really the moon. It's just this kind of gray area around. That's the penumbra. That literally is what a penumbra is. It's a gray area, and judges who are unsatisfied with the amount of power that they have as judges and want more power, they love gray areas. Because you can cram a lot into a gray area. You can just, you can find all kinds of things that don't exist in the Constitution. You can just find the gray area. And so that's what they did in Roe versus Wade. And actually, they were picking up where they had left off in an opinion back in 1965, 8 years before Roe versus Wade, called Griswold v. Connecticut, which is where they, it wasn't the first time the Supreme Court ever used the word penumbra, but it's where they used it, for, I think, for the first time in this context. And what they said was that in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, it not only guarantees process, but it also guarantees these rights that aren't really there. They aren't really in the Constitution, but we know they meant them, and they're in the penumbra of the other rights. And I'll give you an example of how they used it. Back in 1958, there was an opinion, NAACP versus Alabama, I think it was, and basically the NAACP had opened, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had opened an office in Alabama in the 50s. So you can imagine what we're dealing with. And basically a bunch of goobers down there wanted to shut them down. And so what the state of Alabama did was they said, you've got to give us all your papers, including your membership lists. Now, back in the 50s in Alabama, you could get into a kind of a sticky situation if people found out you belonged to the NAACP. And so what the NAACP did is they said, listen, you can't do this. You can't ask for it's a violation of our constitutional rights to ask for our membership lists. And what they said specifically, it's a violation of our freedom of speech, freedom of speech, which is inarguably in the First Amendment to the Constitution. And so when it got up to the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court did is they started playing a little bit fast and loose with the wording of the Constitution. They didn't go crazy, but they just started cheating a little. And what they did was they started down a slippery slope. Now, people will disagree on whether that decision was rightly or wrongly decided. I think it was wrongly decided. But what they did was they said, listen, the freedom of speech that you have in the First Amendment to the Constitution doesn't just mean to talk, for me to get up here and talk to you right now. It also means association. You can't just getting together and having the right to stand up and say something, even something unpopular. That's worth something, but it's really not worth a heck of a lot if you can't associate with other like-minded people, because that's really how you affect social change. And so if you in any way restrict the freedom of association, you're restricting the freedom of speech. The problem with that, now, there's a very good purpose behind it. There was a very good, in this case, I believe, a very good policy behind it. What they didn't want, what the Supreme Court found abhorrent, what they didn't like, was that the state of Alabama was trying to force the NAACP, a group which stood up for the rights of black people, trying to force them, strong-arm them out of the state. That's what they were trying to do. The Supreme Court didn't like it. And so they said, freedom of speech is not just freedom of speech, it's also association. And you can't really associate in Alabama if you don't have your privacy. So it involves a right to privacy. That was a bit of a leap, but it wasn't that much of a leap, because in effect, that was true. That these people didn't really have a freedom of speech down in Alabama if the government was going to come in and say, we're going to make it so miserable for you to belong to this group that you're not going to want to belong to it. Well, you really can't say that there's an unfettered freedom of speech in Alabama, if that's the case. And so what the Supreme Court said in the NAACP decision is they said, you've got a freedom of speech includes the freedom of association and includes this element of privacy. So then we go ahead now to 1965, and now we're talking. Now the Supreme Court is dealing with another law. This law is a Connecticut statute that says you can't use contraceptive. So and there are various criminal penalties for doctors prescribing contraceptive and couples using contraceptive. the members of the court found this bizarre, that a state would try to tell people what they can and can't do in the privacy of their own home. That's an argument for another day. Whether or not a state law saying you can't use contraceptive is wise or not is a political decision. In a representative democracy, the people, through their elected representatives, make those decisions, not unelected judges down in Washington, D.C. Because we are a democracy. We are ruled by the people, by our elected representatives. And those representatives have to come back to us periodically and ask to be sent back. And we can kick them out of office. That's the way a democracy works. But the Supreme Court didn't like that. And they said, no, this is going beyond the beyonds here. The state of Connecticut, the legislature of the state of Connecticut is restricting their own people's rights. And I believe it was Douglas, William O. Douglas, who wrote the opinion for the court. And he said, there's a right to privacy in the Constitution. And he referred back to the NAACP. This is what the court rightfully does, is they look at precedent. They look at previous opinions, and they use those to build a new opinion. That often is very good because it restricts the court from going crazy. But it also can be very bad because once they start down a slippery slope, they just keep sliding. And that's exactly what happened here. Douglas says, oh look, there's a right to privacy in NAACP. The court said it. And that right to privacy certainly involves what a couple does in their bedroom. And so we're going to tell the state of Connecticut whether they can make contraceptive legal or not, because of this right to privacy in the Constitution. Again, don't bother reading the Constitution to try to find the right to privacy. You're wasting your time. It's not there. It doesn't exist. They made it up. It's a penumbra. They found a penumbra, and they squeezed it in there, and that gave them the power to then tell the state of Connecticut, the legislature of the state of Connecticut, what they can and can't do, as if they themselves were elected representatives. What Justice Douglas should have done in that situation, if he found that law so objectionable, is he should have stepped down from the United States Supreme Court, he should have moved to Connecticut, and he should have run for the legislature, and he should have voted to overturn the law. That's what he should have done. That's what we do in a representative democracy. But Douglas didn't want to do that. And so what he did is he cheated. And he found a right to privacy in the Constitution, and he, all of a sudden, found a right to contraceptive in the Constitution. And then, so what happens then in 1973, we come up to Roe versus Wade. And in Roe versus Wade, the situation, you may already know this, but there's Jane Roe was the plaintiff in that case, except her name really isn't Jane Roe, it's Norma McCorvey, and she actually happens to be a pro-life activist now. But at the time, Norma McCorvey was a real rough around the edges woman who had gotten herself, as she put it, into trouble. She got herself pregnant, and she didn't want to have the baby, she wanted to have an abortion. And so she made up a lie. She said she was gang raped. And I want to have the abortion because I was gang raped. Problem is, she lived in Texas, and the law in Texas said no abortion except for in cases of the life of the mother. So she sued, and all the pro-abortion activists got on her side, and they brought this up to the Supreme Court. And Justice Harry Blackmun wrote the opinion for the court in Roe versus Wade. And what he said is, we got the right to privacy. It doesn't only protect the NAACP in Alabama. It doesn't only protect the people in Connecticut with their contraceptive. It now creates a right to an abortion. So now, in the Constitution, there is a right to an abortion. Harry Blackmun found it there. He found it, again, in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, before I deal a little more with Roe versus Wade, let me back up a little bit and just talk about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and it was part of what they call the Reconstruction Amendments. There were 3 amendments to the Constitution that were passed right around the same time after the Civil War, clearly dealing with the problems of race and giving rights, guaranteeing rights to people of color, to black people, that they had been denied. So the 13th Amendment was, first of all, made slavery unconstitutional. Involuntary servitude is what they called it. The 14th Amendment, we'll go into a little more detail, and then the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights regardless of the color of your skin. Very good things, obviously. The 14th Amendment included something called the Due Process Clause. And what that said, and I want to make sure I get it just right, is no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's not very complicated. What does that mean? First of all, the due process clause is almost verbatim taken out of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution was part of the Bill of Rights. It was passed right after the Constitution was ratified, and it applies to the federal government. Now, the 14th Amendment, that applies to the states. Again, remember, we've just come through the Civil War, and the country is coming together and recognizing the rights of black people. And so, again, they repeat the Due Process Clause, and now they apply it to the states. And it says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, in reality, in practice, what does that mean? Well, all of you, if you've been watching the news at all recently, saw that in practice. Casey Anthony down in Florida. I guarantee you there are a lot of people in Florida that would have liked to skip right past due process and move right on to execution or life imprisonment. They would have liked to deprive her of her life or her liberty without due process of law. But they can't do it because we live in a country of laws. Man's law. This is a distinction then from what the professor was telling you. What I'm referring to is not the natural law, not God's law. I'm referring to man's law. And we live in a country of laws where we are protected, all of us, regardless of how powerful we are, how weak we are, regardless of how popular we are. God knows Casey Anthony wasn't very popular. We are protected by these laws. And what the law says in the case of the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, is you can't take somebody's right to life away, or you can't take their property away, or you can't take their liberty away, their freedom away, without due process of law. And it's as simple as that. That's what they meant. That's what it meant. You saw it in action with Casey Anthony. But the courts, again, the justices in the courts were frustrated with the amount of power that they had, that they weren't able to actually set policy, which is the job of the people in a democracy. They're only able to interpret the law. And so what they did was they found in the 14th Amendment to the Due Process Clause to the 14th Amendment, they found certain substantive rights buried into the 14th Amendment. Nobody knew they were there. The people who wrote the 14th Amendment, the people who passed the 14th Amendment, they didn't know they were there. They hid them so well, they didn't even know they put the right to abortion in there. As a matter of fact, there were several states, I think it was 30-something states, that actually had laws prohibiting abortion in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was passed. So if there was a right to an abortion, if those laws were unconstitutional due to the 14th Amendment, the people who wrote the 14th Amendment, the people who ratified the 14th Amendment, had no clue. It took a smart man named Harry Blackmun in 1973 to find that magical right to abortion in the 14th Amendment. And if you're detecting a little bit of sarcasm in my voice, it's nonsense. It's pure, unadulterated nonsense. There is no right to abortion in the 14th Amendment. And if you take nothing else away from this, understand that. So what this is, when you hear it, and you may hear, if you have the misfortune like me of going to law school at some point, you'll certainly hear the concept of substantive due process. And this is, again, one of these legal concepts. It's very complicated. People write long law review articles on it. It takes a lot of time to figure it out, to read it, and to understand it. And the reason why is because it's nonsense. What we do as lawyers, I am not a brain surgeon. I'm an idiot, basically. And what we do as lawyers is something that anybody can do. This is not, what I do is not brain surgery. What I do, the laws are written to be understood by everybody. And so if you read an opinion, and they're coming up with a concept like substantive due process, saying that, gee, process means a process, like a trial. In Casey Anthony, that's what process means. And somebody says to you, oh, no, you're too dumb. You just don't understand. It's more than that. In addition to that, there's this thing called substantive due process. So all these rights that you can't see in there, they're actually there. That's nonsense. Don't fall for that garbage. And that's exactly what the court did in Roe versus Wade. And what the court said is that it struck down the Texas law, and it said that it was unconstitutional, and in the process, it wiped out all of the other abortion laws in the state. In the states, I think every single one in the United States was made unconstitutional by the Roe versus Wade decision. And what he said, Justice Blackmun said, was, for the first 6 months, he broke pregnancy up into trimesters. The court has since admitted, even while upholding Roe versus Wade, they've admitted that's nonsense. But what he did was he broke pregnancy up into trimesters. My wife has gone through 4 pregnancies. They just dropped me off. We have 4 kids in the minivan. I can tell you that there wasn't any, event that happened at 3 months and 6 months. The only event happened at 9 months. And but Blackmun broke it up into 3 trimesters, and he said in the first 2 trimesters you essentially can't do anything. Courts, the states can do nothing to restrict abortion. But then in the last 3 months, you can do a lot to restrict abortion for these last in this last trimester, and that's because the state's interest in protecting the life of the fetus at that point outweighs the woman's interest in killing the fetus. But then he said, hold on, 2 exceptions. You got to have an exception for the life of the mother and the health of the mother. And then they decided another opinion the same day. Doe v. Bolton, rhymes Roe and Doe, very easy to remember. Same 7-2 decision, 7 justices in favor, 2 opposed. Same guys on either side, and they were all guys. They were all 9 old men, and same guy writing the opinion. And in the Doe v. Bolton decision, he said, "Oh, by the way, the health of the mother, that means pretty much anything." So essentially, what he was doing was saying, abortion on demand, all 9 months of pregnancy, states. Don't you even consider making it illegal through all 9 months of pregnancy because of Roe versus Wade. Pure nonsense and offensive. Offensive not only, of course, because it involves the killing of an innocent human being, but offensive from a common sense intellectual perspective, because we live in a representative democracy where we make the decisions, not some old man in Washington, D.C. wearing a robe. So this is what we are left with in 1973. It was a monumental change in abortion policy throughout the United States. Abortion wasn't illegal, by the way. You should be aware. In 1973, it wasn't illegal in all situations in all the states. Many of the states had quote unquote liberalized their abortion laws and allowed it. The point of the matter is, before Roe versus Wade, the states could decide. The people decided. The people came up with the solution. And then after 1973, the court said, no, people don't decide. We already made up our minds. We're setting the policy on this one. That is unconstitutional. And that you can find in the Constitution. Because if you go to the first article, Article 1 of the Constitution, you'll find that the legislative power, the political power, is reserved to the Congress. And the judiciary only, which is the United States Supreme Court, specifically mentioned in Article 3, only has judicial power. And what judicial power means is the administration of the laws. They don't set the government policy. That's what the people do in a democracy. Article 1, the legislature, elected by the people. Article 3, the judiciary just interprets the law and resolves disputes regarding the law. And what the courts did in Roe versus Wade is they said, nah, we're setting policy on this one. And that's why it's unconstitutional. And even pro-abortion activists, most pro-abortion legal scholars acknowledge Roe versus Wade was a bad decision. It was poorly decided. It got the result they wanted, but they admit it's on very weak constitutional ground. So, since Roe versus Wade, it has been challenged from time to time. States have passed laws that have ended up in front of the Supreme Court, and the question of whether Roe versus Wade would continue as the law of the land was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. I won't go into every single one. I see I'm actually getting close to my time. But I will tell you about 2 of them, Webster and Casey. In 1989, the court decided the Webster decision. And this was a case involving Missouri law prohibiting state funding, state facilities to be used in the practice of abortion. And the court upheld the law, said the law is, this restriction on abortion is perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional. But Justice O'Connor, appointed by our pro-life friend Ronald Reagan, actually found a way to uphold the law while still upholding the legality of Roe versus Wade and ensuring that Roe versus Wade remained the law of the land, which was a disaster for the pro-life movement. Because we cannot pass laws contrary to Roe versus Wade, obviously as long as it's the law of the land. So then in 1992, the state of Pennsylvania passes a number of restrictions on abortion, and this is you may have heard of it, the Casey decision, which was I would say a landmark decision, but a big decision. And again, the court had the opportunity to overrule Roe versus Wade. They had a number of restrictions that were passed by the Pennsylvania legislature. One was informed consent, that you had to give certain information to a woman before she had an abortion, a mandatory waiting period. There were a couple others, I can't remember what they were. But one of them was spousal consent, that if you're a married woman and you're pregnant before you have an abortion, you got to tell the father that you're going to kill this kid. So that was one of the other restrictions that Pennsylvania passed. Immediately, Planned Parenthood challenges it, gets up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court again upheld most of the restrictions. The only one they found unconstitutional was the spousal consent one, which is kind of a strange one, and certainly doesn't recognize any rights on the part of a father. But again, Justice O'Connor, this time joined by Justice Kennedy and I believe Souter, upheld Roe versus Wade. Basically said a lot of what's in Roe versus Wade is complete and total nonsense. First of all, the trimester stuff, throw it out. It's nonsense. That's what O'Connor said. However, the basic holding of Roe versus Wade, which is that there is a right in the Constitution to an abortion, that stands. And so they upheld Roe versus Wade. Again, it was a disaster for the pro-life movement. So that is essentially, now there have been numerous other decisions before and since that touch on the issue of abortion, but those are really the big ones. One of the issues that has come up is partial birth abortion, but the upshot is that Roe versus Wade remains good law, which means it remains the law of the land, which means that your hands are tied as pro-life activists. You don't waste your time trying to get pro-life laws passed, because they'll all get struck down or most of them will be struck down by the United States Supreme Court as unconstitutional because of Roe versus Wade. Now, I certainly am not telling you don't get involved, don't try to get these laws passed, because we can continue to challenge the Supreme Court to expose the nonsense that Roe versus Wade is, but it remains the law of the land. There's one thing that's very important that you should know about the Casey decision, is that Justice O'Connor spent a lot of time talking about a concept called stare decisis. Once again, if they're using Latin terms, and if it takes numerous pages to explain what they're talking about, alarm bells should be going off. We've got nonsense coming up here. And that's what it is. What stare decisis says, and I won't say that the entire concept is nonsense, but certainly as applied in Casey it is. What she's saying, stare decisis means let the decision stand. And what she's saying is, we shouldn't overturn Roe versus Wade because it's the law of the land. And that would be very confusing. And there are people that have made made plans and vacation plans and perhaps chosen jobs and places based on the fact that they can kill their kid. Now we're going to pull the rug out from them. So it's a very unsettling thing to do. So let the decision stand. Even if it's garbage, let it stand. That's what stare decisis means, and that's what O'Connor was saying in the decision. But there's a problem with that. And there's a couple of problems with that. One of them is called Dred Scott. Another one's called Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that you can segregate people based on the color of their skin in schools. So the point of the matter is, the history of the Supreme Court is full of examples of garbage decisions. Awful, immoral, garbage decisions, like Dred Scott and like Plessy versus Ferguson. And those were overruled, one way or the other. I mean, Plessy versus Ferguson was overruled through another opinion. Brown versus Board of Education. With all I'm a lawyer down in Springfield, and every law day, which is once a year, we all get together and celebrate, pat each other on the back for being lawyers. It's a very strange thing. And so at this law day celebration, inevitably, Brown versus Board of Education comes up, this tremendous Supreme Court decision that ended the Plessy versus Ferguson rule of separate but equal. Brown versus Board of Education says separate but equal is never equal. So O'Connor's got a problem. Gee, if the Brown versus Board of Education court was applying my stare decisis rule, they would have left Plessy in there, and we'd still have segregated schools. So she said, well, Unless the facts change, of course. Or if the facts don't change, as they didn't in Brown versus Board of Education, we still had black people and white people, the facts hadn't changed. It still dealt with the color of skin, people still had skin. And so, how did they change? Well, our understanding of the facts changed. That we realized that separate versus equal is not equal. All of a sudden, we just figured that out. See, so that's the difference. And so that's her way of justifying stare decisis. So what does that mean to you? That means that you get up and you fight. You talk to everybody who will listen to you about this issue. You go down to the March for Life and you march right by that Supreme Court every year because what she has admitted in Casey through the stare decisis nonsense that she's going into is that the Supreme Court hears you. And once things get really unpopular, these people like to be popular. Even when they like powerful, they like to be popular. And once it gets unpopular, we change our tune. And so if you want to end abortion, if you want to see Roe versus Wade overturned, make it unpopular. Because then they won't be getting invited to their cocktail parties down there anymore. And once that happens, they're going to overturn Roe versus Wade. So I make a joke, but it's a very serious point. The judiciary is supposed to be interpreting the law, but they don't do that. At least they don't always do that. They are swayed by public opinion, not to the same extent, but just as the legislature is. And so what you're doing is not only important, being a pro-life activist is not only important because it might stop somebody from having abortion. It's not only important because it might get a president elected who's pro-life and who will appoint pro-life justices, but it actually will eliminate the stare decisis argument. That Justice O'Connor, well, she's not on there anymore, but the next one who tries to trot that thing out will not be able to do it because the overwhelming public opinion in America will be pro-life. And at that point, the laws will change. I apologize that I've gone over my time here. I can't believe I did, considering how little I know about the topic. But if you have any questions, again, remember my disclaimer. I'd be glad to take them. Do we have time for?
Yeah, we have time for a couple.
Okay. Anybody have any questions?
Who is Casey Anthony? What was that case about?
Oh, I'm sorry. Casey Anthony was the woman down in Florida who was accused of killing her little girl, 2-year-old girl, Kaylee Anthony. She was the one who just got acquitted. And the only reason I mentioned that, she has no direct relation to abortion, although you could say that it's a little bit odd that 2 years before, if she had decided to discard her child, we would have been applauding her for exercising her constitutional rights. 2 years later, when she does it, she's a monster. But the only reason I mentioned that was because that's an example of the due process, what the due process clause actually means. It means you can't take her life away, you can't take her liberty away without first giving her due process of law, meaning a trial.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're very grateful to Professor Franks and to Mr. Day. Also, this beautiful church, which is so convenient to drive to and easy to find and everything. Bonnie is here. She let us in and she's letting us out. And their pastor is on vacation right now, but I think he might stop in one of the nights that we're here. And so we're very grateful to them. We're looking forward to seeing all of you next week for Linda Thayer. Before you leave, if you have any trash or cans go in the brown bag. There's a box for the trash.